Hey there, and welcome to the Upside Down People podcast. I'm your host, Caleb, and whether this is your first time joining in or you're a regular friend of the show, I'm just so glad that you're with us here today. If you haven't already, please be sure to follow us, like or subscribe on our Spotify, on our Apple podcasts, or on our YouTube platforms. And yet, if you have been enjoying these conversations, or if you enjoy the conversation that we're about to get into, please be sure to share it with your family and friends. This is a podcast where we seek to have gospel-centered conversations with people who love Jesus. And today's guest is a well-known Christian scholar and author. He's known for his influential books such as Biblical Critical Theory and Difficult Atheism, as well as his work in exploring the intersections of philosophy, theology, and culture. And he seeks to offer a biblical lens on modern life. Once again, I'm grateful to spend time and have this conversation with none other than Dr. Christopher Watkin. Well, I'm joined here once again with Dr. Christopher Watkin. Thanks so much for joining the show. Chris, how are you going?
It's wonderful to be here again, Caleb. Thank you for having me back. We're going fine. We're middle of semester teaching at the moment, so it's all hands to the pump. But it's lovely to take a little bit of time to do this with you.
Yeah, I appreciate you taking the time out. I can appreciate how teachers and then also like lecturers as well have such a full schedule. And then on top of that, I don't know how you fit in things like family, and then even, I know you're writing a new book as well, but you've authored books previously. I know our last conversation was on biblical critical theory. So I just don't understand how you fit all of that in and find the time for spaces of, just solitude and rest and things like that.
I think that might be slightly over-egging the pudding. I'm not sure I would describe my life as full of solitude and rest at all.
No, that's what I'm saying. I don't know how you'd manage to find the time with all the things going on.
Well, it's a labour of love, isn't it? One does what one feels is important, and will make a difference by God's grace. And I guess that's what I'm trying to do.
Oh, brilliant. Well, it's been, I think, almost a year since our last conversation that we recorded. Maybe you can give a snapshot into what you've been up to, what you've been working on, or just something that you've really enjoyed doing and putting yourself into over the past, 12 or so months.
Yeah. Well, I won't wax lyrical about my family life, although that's probably been the greatest joys over the last year or so. Look, in terms of work and things that I've been writing and producing, I suppose two things. I've been engaging a little bit in a way that sort of surprised myself to begin with the thought and the podcasts of Jordan Peterson, just a way of trying to come to terms with what he's saying from a Christian point of view. That's been really interesting. And in terms of big projects, I'm starting to think about the idea of the common good from a Christian point of view, what a biblical theology of the common good might look like. And still quite early stages at the moment, but I'm beginning to get a sense of how the Bible might have a very distinctive take on what the common good might be, and also trying to weave into that some reflections on the thing that gets called the meaning crisis. So a number of people have sort of mentioned this idea and given it the label the meaning crisis, and so I'm trying to think about the common good and the meaning crisis as two aspects of the same problem, and the Bible as an incisive response to both of them.
That's brilliant, and I can definitely see the intersection of why you'd be interested in what Jordan Peterson has to say, because that's sort of a lot of what he's been unpacking and trying to wrestle with. And in terms of a cultural perspective, a lot of particularly millennials and Gen Zs are focused on what he has to say because he's had this like rise to prominence. So when he opens his mouth, whether people like him or not, people are listening to what he has to say, which is
He has made a huge difference in the lives of many people, and it's one of the things that I'm no Peterson expert. I've listened to and read quite a bit of what he's done, but I don't claim to have an exhaustive knowledge. But one thing that becomes very clear very quickly as you delve into his speaking and his writing is that he has had a profound effect on many, many people. And many people would credit him with having rescued them from the meaning crisis or whatever it is, and have a very deep, abiding respect for him.
Yeah, very much so. And I know his work and his writing particularly resonates with young men as well. And like you're saying, in that whole idea of the meaning crisis, because there is a crisis of identity within most people, go through a stage of trying to find out who they are and why they're here and answer the bigger existential questions of life. But particularly I've noticed as well, like just with regards to mental health and anxiety and depression and these sort of things are increasing in young men, and I think they've sort of seen a different point of view with Peterson, and they've attached themselves to that, and it's helped them wrestle with these things of meaning and identity. But with that said, obviously, as a Christian, a lot of people can get confused as well when Peterson talks, because he does talk with a confidence, and he's got a wealth of knowledge, and he also is able to dissect and unpack things. But then he's not. I wouldn't say he's outrightly a Christian. He advocates for the morals of the Bible, and he's very much for it. But then there's nuances in his teachings that could be potentially misleading, and that's sort of what I was when I've watched a few of your videos that you did in response to Peterson, how you sort of see he puts this idea of finding, or the meaning crisis, as you need to climb a ladder of moral values. So it's sort of, you can get yourself out of it, and that's the way to do, I don't know, to be a better human, to find human flourishing is climb this ladder of moral values. And he sort of points to the Bible as this is a helpful guide to do that. But that's obviously, it's not completely true. So what's been your response to some of the things that Peterson has said?
Yeah, I think you're right to say that there are many echoes of distinctively Christian themes in the way that he navigates the world and the meaning crisis. But, he would say of himself, and the last things that I've heard of him have said that he's not a professing Christian. And I think that also comes through in what he says and how he says it. I think there are tools available to the Christian that he just can't pick up. And it's the inability to wield those tools that I think makes his response to the meaning crisis, powerful though it is, really quite problematic. Let's just try and hit two reasons why I think that's the case. The first is that, as I understand Peterson, he sets up an opposition between a hedonistic self that sort of indulges in its desires, and what he calls a self of voluntary self-sacrifice. And he sees that the self of voluntary self-sacrifice as the way to overcome the desires of the hedonistic self and to build, a self of dignity and worth that can be proud of itself and puff out its chest and go out into the world. And from a biblical point of view, I think it becomes clear relatively quickly that those two selves have got a lot more in common than divides them. Because what his hedonistic self is doing is it's privileging one of its faculties and dampening down all the others so that this one faculty can reign supreme, and that one faculty is the desire. My impulses in the moment dictate my actions. I want to drink a lot, smoke a lot, have sex a lot, whatever it is, that makes me feel happy in the moment I do that. But the self of voluntary self-sacrifice, although it looks very different on the surface, actually has a very similar structure, because it's privileging that faculty for rational self-control in the self and subordinating the rest of the self to it. It's quite a stoic stance to take. And I think there are a number of issues that arise from that. First of all, there's the issue of, well, what is there apart from the self itself? So a circular argument to say this is the part of the self that should be privileged, actually, in a way that transcends the self's own self-appreciation. Like, in other words, why not hedonism?
Right.
What argument can you have against the hedonist who says, I'm actually quite happy as a hedonist? I think self-control is, whatever, totalitarian, imperialistic. I think our desires should guide us in life. I'm not clear what he would be able to say to that, apart from, the cricket player saying to the soccer player, yes, but you can't score runs, and the soccer player saying to the cricket player, yes, but you can't score goals. In other words, taking criteria internal to one's own system and judging another system on the basis of them. So there's that issue. And I think the Bible has a more radical approach to both the hedonistic self and the self of voluntary self-sacrifice, which is the self received as a gift from God. And in one of my videos, I try and draw this out of Augustine, who has a very similar diagnosis to Peterson, but a very different prognosis. Okay. So Augustine has this idea of the distentio animi, the scattered self. I'm an enigma to myself, he says. I've got all these desires bubbling up. 10 o'clock in the morning, I feel like this sort of person. By 3 p.m., I feel like another sort of person. Who am I? Who is this bag of desires?
It's almost like Augustine, Paul talks about how he desires to do one thing, yet his actions are another thing. And there's this war within.
Yeah. Yeah. And, Romans 7 that you're quoting there, who will rescue me from this body of sin? He doesn't say, well, let my reason then rule over my appetite. That's the way that I'm going to be rescued from this body of sin. It's actually an external locus of integration. Paul says, thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. And so it's the idea that the coherence of myself doesn't come at the price of one of my faculties dominating all the others, whether it's my desire or my stoic reason. It comes from actually reaching outside myself, and something that Tim Keller called the virtue or the blessing of self-forgetfulness. And I find my integration as I reach out in a posture of praise to the God who made me and knows me. And this is Augustine's idea of, that famous quote from the Confessions, interior intimo meo et superior sumo meo. So God is more intimate to me than I am to myself, and higher than the highest in me. Wow. That image of height obviously appeals to Peterson. And so I find coherence as a self, not by one part of me dominating another part of me, but by losing myself in praise to the only one who truly knows me. And that, I think, is a fundamentally different way to engage with the meaning crisis and the sense of a dissipation of identity. So that's the first way that I think Peterson not having the tools of Christianity really shows itself in his system. Do you want me to go into the second one, or do you want to come back on that?
we can go. Yeah, I definitely want to hear the second one. I just in terms of unpacking that one just a bit more. So there seems to be what you're saying is like these competing ideas, which have also sort of infiltrated in society. Is like one is you give yourself over to desires, which you're talking about the hedonistic self, and then the other is like you give yourself over to control, which is voluntary self-sacrifice. So everything. To find meaning, you try and control things in your life, whether it's your emotions, your appetites, your desire, whatever that looks. And that's why I think you're saying like the Stoics were very good at that. What if you can unpack a bit more? Like, what is the danger of leaning into one of those over the other and not like trying to understand and apply the biblical lens to your life?
I think part of it is that they both crush you in the end. Neither of them are good masters. Desires are great. A lot of our lives run on the fuel of desire, and trying to quash one's impulses and desires, I think, is very damaging. And also, rationality is invaluable. So I'm not saying that these things are defective, but they don't make good monarchs of the self. Desire, for many of the reasons that are readily thinkable, if someone gives himself over to a life of drugs or whatever, that the stories that circulate in our culture of that ending well are few and far between. But perhaps the idea that rationality is not a great, or stoic self-sacrifice is not a great master, needs a little bit more unpacking. I think the problem here is partly Paul's problem in Romans 7. It's that you're never good enough. And there's a sense in which that's motivating. Well, I never want to have arrived. I always want to be climbing. But as life goes on, I think the sort of the lodestar of perfect control becomes the tyranny of perfect control. And you either have to face the reality that you're not the person that your ideology, or in Christian terms, your idol of self-control, would have you to be, which leads to despair. I think if you take it seriously, that leads to despair. Or you have to renounce it altogether. And I think I tried to show in one of my videos on Peterson that I think that's where his system ultimately leads. You either have to stop being serious about it and just play at self-control, or if you are fully serious about it, you end up inevitably staring despair in the face, especially as you get older. So I just don't think it's very healthy. And I think that both of those positions, either giving yourself over to your desire or seeking sort of an utter voluntary self-sacrifice, do damage to the intricate complexity of what it is to be a human being. I don't think any one of our faculties is meant to or does well when it rules over the others. I think you get truncated, shriveled, sort of disproportioned people, as if every day down the gym were upper body day and it was never leg day. People who just look strange when that happens. I think it's much more satisfying to have as an aim to integrate all of our faculties, not by making one of them the imperialistic overlord of the others, but by finding some principle of integration that's outside the self, which I think is precisely the tool that Peterson cannot pick up because he doesn't have that biblical metaphysics.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And why do you think, this may be very simple in in asking, but it always fascinates me is, why do you think there is this tension within individuals and society as a whole to sort of pick one over the other as a framework to try and wrestle with, as opposed to, like you're saying, that disintegrates your humanity, and it actually it doesn't lead to human flourishing. So why do we continue to choose one over the other?
That is such a deep question. I think, hesitatingly, that it's one aspect of a much, much bigger problem that we've got, which is wherever you look, whether it's in terms of personal identity or whether it's in terms of social cohesion, we've got a massive sharing problem today. We don't share well. And so the one aspect of that you've raised there is that we find it hard to find, and this language might seem strange to begin with, but hopefully I'm going to spin it out in a way that makes it seem less strange, is that we find it hard to find a common good among our different faculties, like how to get my desire and my will and my reason working together for a common weal, a common wealth. That doesn't mean that one of them has to dominate the others. Like, is there any way of doing it that is non-imperial? Would be the way of thinking about that in terms of the self. And then when you get to society, it looks pretty similar. We're not that good these days, I would suggest, at sharing the space of society across differences. You see that in political polarization. You see it in what gets called the culture wars. You see it in what some people have called the increasing tribalization of society. Society sort of siloing itself off into different antagonistic groups that see the game of society as a zero-sum game between them. And in some ways, that's a macrocosm of this microcosmic problem of the self. So whether you look at society or the self, we don't do sharing very well anymore. And that's a problem. It's a problem socially in terms of fracture and antagonism, and different parts of society just not understanding each other anymore, regardless of whether there's agreement or disagreement, just not understanding how people who are not like me see the world. I think there is a crisis of that. And I think on the level of the self, there's a lot of the meaning crisis that can be explained in terms of this fragmentation of the self, but not just fragmentation, a fragmentation that leaves us in a position where we're unable to find a way of holding the fragments together. I think that's the key issue. It's not simply that the self is fragmented, it's that we can't find a common good among the fragments, or even a commons among the fragments anymore.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And just before we jump into your second point is, why do you think that we struggle with sharing in the place that we find ourselves today? Because I think that's a really powerful point that you've made, or observation. And I have heard it before that a lot of, in terms of from a biblical lens, is like a lot of our issues and sin stems from this place of seeing ourselves in a place of lack. So if we have little, or we don't have enough, we want to try and hold things closer. Whereas if our view of God is he's generous, he's enough, he's very much the opposite of lack. We don't have to hold. I'm doing a poor job of explaining it, but that seems like part of what the issue may be in terms of sharing. I know having a toddler, teaching them how to share is a difficult thing because everything's like mine, and they I don't know if it's because it's going to get stolen or something like that, but it's a really powerful point that you made. So I'm curious to understand, why do you think we don't share, or we struggle with that?
Again, it's a deep and fascinating question. And look, I can give you some sketches of a response. This is still very much work that I'm beginning rather than coming to the end of. And so I've got some ideas, but I wouldn't want to die on the hill of any of them at this stage. But look, let me just share with you what my thinking is at this stage. If you look at the models of sharing that we have in, just take the Western tradition, which is the tradition that I know something about. The models that come from the Christian part, the Judeo-Christian part of that tradition, look really quite different to the models that come from elsewhere. We've already mentioned the idea of the stoic self and the way in which there's a certain imperialism to one faculty, or to the rational self-control dominating other faculties. I think you could tease that out in terms of Roman imperialism and Greek Macedonian imperialism as well in ways that I'm not competent to walk through at the moment. But one thing that I have read recently that I just found really fascinating is Joseph Henrich's book, The Weirdest People in the World. And he makes the argument that I think is a persuasive one, that the idea that we can have common cause with people outside our tribe, so outside our clan or outside our blood relatives, is first of all a strange idea if you look at ancient civilizations, and a distinctively Judeo-Christian idea. So if you think about the early church in Acts, especially the church in Philippi, it is the most extraordinarily subversive institution. So you've got three figures in there. You've got the Roman jailer, you've got Lydia, the successful businesswoman, and you've got the slave girl. And in no ancient universe can they belong together as a community. That all of the barriers of ancient society are being played with and transgressed in that community. You trade with people who are like you. You do business with people who are like you. You do not form communities across gender, socioeconomic, ethnic lines in this way. And yet along comes Christianity, and lo and behold, it does. That famous verse in Galatians, there's now, no longer male or female, Greek or Jew, slave or free, all are one in Christ Jesus. There's a new external point of integration for human community that means community is no longer limited by blood or by soil. And I use those two terms advisedly. A lot of the imperialism of the last 100 or so years has been a blood and soil imperialism. And so Christianity comes along with a new vision of what the common good can be. Not blood-based, not soil-based, but based on this exterior integration point. So it's not just simply that there are no longer male and female, etc. You need some way of building community that is not those ancient categories. And that's where all our one in Christ Jesus comes in. So once you've got that fundamental integration point in Christ Jesus, so our identity is now most fundamentally anchored in something outside of us, that you can have the Philippian church coming together. And just to circle back on what we were talking about earlier, it's because Peterson, I think, can't go that extra step and say all our one in Christ Jesus, that he can't use, he can't leverage this incredibly powerful dynamic of either integration of the self or integration of society that is available to the Christian.
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. And I know you're teasing out some ideas that you are thinking around your new work that you're doing. But before we dive more into that, so going over the first reason, circling back to, if you remember what the second reason was. So we're talking about the first reason for Peterson, the response to Peterson in terms of, you're talking about the hedonistic self and the voluntary self-sacrifice, why he struggles. And then do you remember what the second reason was? Or is that pulling back too far.
No, I do. It is circling back quite a way, isn't it? Let's
It
look
is.
back. So I think that the second really fascinating thing about Peterson is that he banks a lot of money he can't account for, in the sense that he uses or assumes or needs to assume a lot of Christianity for his own system of voluntary self-sacrifice to make sense. I think there are 4 ways he does this. Let's see if I remember them. I think he needs grace, just on his own terms, something like grace, because he assumes something like a trustworthy universe, a universe that's structured toward truth and meaning, that truth is discernible by us. And, as Alvin Plantinga and many others have advised, that is by no means a given. Evolution selects for survival, not for truth. And so on what basis can we think that the universe is predisposed toward me understanding it truthfully? Well, from a Christian point of view, the fact that there is a gracious logos, a gracious God, is writing that check that the Christian can then cash. I don't think anyone writes that check for Peterson, and yet he banks it. So that's one issue. The second is that I think existentially his system requires something that looks a lot like forgiveness if it's to be serious. So you can play at Peterson, and I'm not suggesting he does this by any means, but you can sort of entertain the idea of stoic self-sacrifice and sort of float along on the idea that you're being Petersonian, but to really embrace it at a very deep existential level, to confront your own darkness and your own failings. Certainly speaking personally, I think that is psychologically viable only if there's some hope for forgiveness. Because, I don't know about your listeners or viewers, but my heart is dark, can be dark. And to come face to face with that without some sense that there is a power at work greater than my own will to confront that, I think is existentially devastating. And so without something like forgiveness, I think Peterson's system, it is existentially crushing, and ultimately, if we are to be deadly serious about it right to the end, untenable. And right. I cashed that out in a little bit more depth in one of the videos that I did. The third thing I think he needs is something that looks very much like the cross of Christ. Because our self-sacrifice, which I think there's a lot in the Bible that agrees that our life is one where we deny the self, take up the cross, follow Christ. But precisely in the Bible, it is a taking up of the cross and following Christ. Like he died first, if you like. He took up the cross and died, rearranging the very fabric of the universe, so to speak, such that I can know the ground of being. I can be in, it sounds almost unsayable. I can be in a love relationship with the source of all things in the universe. Like how crazy is that? But without something like that, what am I doing? In a cold, dark, meaningless universe that doesn't even not care about me. It just doesn't do anything about me. I'm assuming that through slightly rearranging my life so that it's more self-sacrificial than it otherwise would have been, something meaningful is being done. That is a huge leap of faith. And so I think without Christ's substitutionary cross, which in a sense folds the Logos into my life, into my story, such that my life does now have a meaning that goes beyond my cranium, and I'm not playing games when I take up my cross and follow Christ. I'm not simply satisfying a desire that I have. I am doing something cosmically meaningful. Without that, I think our cross-bearing, quote unquote, becomes I don't know how you describe it. It sort of becomes a parody of itself,
Right.
or an empty gesture in the void, and the void doesn't
Yeah.
care about it. But if
Self-flagellation.
Christ has, sorry, mate. Sorry, Caleb, I didn't catch what you said there. Can you hear me? Okay. Caleb, can you hear me, mate?
Yeah. Dropped out for a
Okay.
second, but you're back.
You're fine. Let me just carry on. So,
Yes.
without something like Christ's substitutionary cross-bearing, our sacrificial cross-bearing, I think, is either a parody of itself or just an empty gesture in the void. But I think with Christ's cross, then our cross-bearing becomes not only meaningful in the sense of, improving my life, quote unquote, but it becomes cosmically meaningful. It becomes folded into the very logos of creation in a way that, again, that I think that's just not a tool that Peterson can pick up because he doesn't have the biblical framework. He doesn't explicitly have the biblical framework that you require for that, and yet he still tries to inhabit a position that assumes it. And just very quickly, the fourth thing, I think Peterson requires or assumes that he has something like an affinity between truth and goodness. So in other words, truth is good for Peterson.
Yeah.
But I don't think he can explain or justify why. So, his principle, tell the truth, it
no matter what.
assumes that there is something fundamentally good and beneficial about doing that. But I don't think that's self-evident within his own universe. I don't think that's guaranteed, again, by evolutionary principles. But I do think it's guaranteed if the Logos is Christ. And so again, I think he's banking all that capital without explicitly owning it. And I'm not beating up on him. I just think it's worth realizing that that's what he's doing.
Yeah. With the last one, why don't you think it's that in terms of that affinity between truth and goodness? Why don't you think that it's a universal principle that Peterson sort of advocates for, that no matter what, the truth will set you free in the sense of it will bring goodness? What about it is particularly connected to the biblical lens, or this this person of Jesus?
I think part of it is connected to the Christian idea of judgment, which I think he also smuggles in. So if I am accountable to a judge who judges perfectly and sees everything, then I have a very deep interest in my life in coming to that moment of judgment with a minimum of things that I'm ashamed of. And I don't want to be confronted on that day with a judge who says, I know the way that you've been lying, and that is wrong. If there is no such judge, apart from the human conscience, which I think is really quite spectacularly malleable, then it is much harder to make the case that truth-telling is always the right thing to do. One can imagine situations and people, in fact, who have made a very comfortable career out of lying to themselves and to other people, and who have died with, so to speak, many toys and very large bank accounts in great comfort. And if that's it, if that death is the final moment, then I think it's hard to say that there is something objective saying that those lives were bad lives, in terms of pleasure, fulfillment, richness, happiness, breadth of experiences, all of these measures contained within this life, they did pretty well. And it happened to be on the back of lying. And so I think without something outside the human mind to hold us to account for truth-telling, I don't know that you can convince someone who's doing very well, thank you very much, by lying, that they should throw all that away.
Yeah, that makes sense. And do you think a part of it as well is this idea that it seems like is in a lot of Peterson's talking is this idea of hierarchy? I know you mentioned it at the start. He has an affinity towards hierarchy. But do you think that the affinity towards truth and goodness is that truth is on this hierarchy? So the closer you are to telling the truth, then the more moral your life will be, which is a dangerous message in and of itself, right?
Well, my sense of him, and again, I haven't read or listened to everything he's done, it's just my impressions of his position, is that he needs to believe that. Like, if he cannot equate truth with goodness and put them both at the top of a hierarchy, then he needs to pack up and go home and rethink the way that he sees the world. And so he's so viscerally invested in that equation of truth and goodness that at the expense of everything coming crashing down, he can't contemplate that is not the case.
Yeah. It's a fascinating conversation, and it's, I think, really helpful as well for myself and for many listeners, as Peterson has a beautiful way of articulating truth, and he has garnered such a following, which has helped so many people. But at the same time, like, I think it's important as Christians to not just take everything without first, like, trying to see things through a biblical lens, through that cross-centered lens of what does this look like. And the way you speak reminds me of, I don't know if you watched the interview with Joe Rogan and Wesley Huff, or if you've heard of it.
I did watch that.
Yeah. Because right at the end, Wesley Huff, just it was sort of in the final 5 minutes or so, critiques Peterson as well, and says, like, he'd love to have a conversation with him just regarding, he sees Peterson as elevating the moral life, which, like, there's a conflict of that. If you're taking a biblical lens, is you can't get to God by doing good. You can't climb a hierarchy or climb a ladder, but it's actually in God's descent to us that brings freedom. So I was just like, listening to you talk, it feels like you're unpacking a lot of that thought as well, that potentially, or that critique, which I think is really helpful for Christians.
I think that's really helpful. I hadn't thought of it in that way. Just to put a label on that, I think off the back of what you've just said, it's helped me to clarify it in my own mind, that I think what he systematically does with Christian doctrines like the cross or Jacob's ladder or whatever it is he reads the biblical version of something. So there are equivalents of Jacob's ladder in other cultures and civilizations. He reads the biblical version of it as just one more example of the universal cultural trope. And what that misses is that the Bible systematically subverts these cultural tropes at the same time as it fulfills them. And it's this idea of subversive fulfillment. So right there in Genesis 1, you've got a lot of echoes of, Babylonian creation myths, but they're echoed from the perspective of being undermined at the same time. He also made the stars. The stars are not deities. That is pushing back against and pulling the carpet out from these extra biblical creation myths. And similarly with what's happening with Jacob's ladder, is that Peterson's reading it as just one more instance off the cultural conveyor belt of this idea of a hierarchy and climbing and ascending, but he's missing the crucial biblical fact that is in the Bible in the mode of being subverted. That as Keller says when he preaches on this passage, that when it's picked up in the New Testament, it's the angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Christ himself is the ladder from heaven to us. And if you miss that, you get a very bland, sort of boring version of the Bible, where it's just one more turn of the crank handle of all these cultures that have got their hierarchies. And you lose the sparkle of the Bible. You lose the sort of deliciously subversive cheekiness of the Bible. And I think it's that cheekiness that he doesn't get. He doesn't get it with the cross, which I think is why he turns it into, personal burden bearing. I don't think he gets it with Jacob's ladder. But that's what I would encourage Christians to hold on to. Don't lose that subversive aspect of the subversive fulfillment of these tropes in the biblical narrative.
Yeah, brilliant. Something I usually do with our guests is ask our previous guest to ask our next guest a question. So I know I feel like this may be a leading question for you, but I feel like it works out well. So my previous guest, Carl Fass, said to ask the next guest, what are you excited about in the next 6 months? So if you're working on anything, I know you've mentioned that you're working on your new book, The Common Good Through a Biblical Lens. Is that something you're excited about, or would you say there's something else?
I am incredibly excited about that. It's just a delight to dig into the Bible, not knowing what you're going to find, having a sort of a set of issues that you're looking at. So, okay, what's a biblical theology of the common good? What's a biblical theology of a healthy, integrated self? And to start with Genesis and to think, oh my goodness, I don't know what I'm going to find here. And then as you go, you think, oh my goodness, how on earth am I going to fit all this material in? It's just time and again that the Bible surprises you with the richness and the depth and the sophistication of the way that it can shape issues and shape your approach to issues. I think that is just so refreshing and exciting, because you don't know what you're going to find. Like it's not cookie cutter. I think the Bible, it's such a complex text that it does continually surprise you. So I am excited by that.
That's great. So in all of that, what's a question that you're coming to the Bible with as you write this book that you're hoping to answer or to unpack?
Well, there's what is a distinctively biblical diagnosis of and response to the meaning crisis. So lots of people are talking about the meaning crisis from different perspectives, which is great, and I'm learning a lot from them. But if you try to build up a response from the Bible up, what would that look like and how would that be different? It's really, really exciting for me. And similarly with political polarization. So lots of people have talked about the culture wars and our fractured, polarized society and why we're fractured, what to do about it. But again, just setting all that aside for a moment, if you try to come at it simply with the Bible as your primary resource, how would the problem look different, and how would the response to it look different? Those are the questions that I'm really excited about.
Those are super great questions, and really applicable and relevant to so many questions on people's minds and hearts. So I'm looking forward to seeing what you discover. Do you have I know it's early days, do you have a expected publish date or finish date for it, or is it just let's see where this goes?
I don't yet, Caleb. I've got some draft chapters, I've got some thoughts. I suspect it'll morph quite a bit until it reaches some sort of final version, but there's no sort of looming deadline. at the
Yeah.
moment.
Yeah, which is, I suppose, great as well. It gives you the freedom to really explore without significant pressure. But I am genuinely looking forward to what you unpack and discover. I so thoroughly enjoyed biblical critical theory because, like what you're saying, it's applying that lens to things of structure and frameworks, and my whole heart is to try and understand, and through various conversations that I'm having, is like to see how the lens, when we put on a biblical lens, a gospel-centered lens, how that impacts the way we do life. And I think this conversation has been an example of that, of there's so much goodness out there, but often, like, without a biblical lens, we could be easily misled and led into a place of self-destruction, or just this, not a place of flourishing in Christ. So, yeah, I am looking forward to that. So the second part of his question is there anything, or what are you fearful about that you're excited of?
That's a really hard question to ask. I certainly haven't felt any fear about it. This is going to sound like a very trite and probably quite a pious answer, but I think it's my genuine answer. I think if you're saved by grace, it's permission to fail, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, like the book might not be that good, and people might not like it, and I might not like it. And do you know what? That's okay. It's like, I'm going to give it a go. We'll see what happens. If it can help people, then praise God. And if it doesn't, then nothing changes about who I am or who I'm going to be in the future. I suppose at least that is how I would like to be thinking. In my better moments, that's how I'd like to be thinking about the project.
Yeah, I was just writing that down as a quote from you. Saved by grace, then we have permission to fail. I think there's so much freedom and beauty in that. And also, funny enough, I think we do, in a Western culture, have this fear of failing, especially with our faith. It's like we don't know how to integrate our faith into our life. So that whole thing of like, well, if we are saved by grace, then we have permission to fail. It's not about us. It's not about what we can do. Again, it comes down to what God has already done. So, it's that. That's
it's the
a great
most
point.
expansive, delightful way to live, isn't it? Because everything that, if you don't have grace, everything that is sort of desperately hopefully waiting for you at the end, like validation, your life was well lived, you've made a difference. All of that is already, so to speak, in the bag. Not in any trite way, but that happened on the cross, and the resurrection signs, seals, and delivers that. So I don't need to work for that. I can sort of, in a sense, and again, this is idealistic, and I'm not claiming I live this. I can forget about myself. I'm done. I'm good. That deal has been done. So let's throw ourselves into other people and so forth. Again, I don't want to come over as saying that's how I live, but that is the ideal, isn't it, for the Christian? I'm okay. Let's focus outward.
Yeah, I love that. So the second part of that is, usually I'll ask our guests, so ask yourself for a question for our next guest. Before I do that, a question that I've really wanted to ask you throughout this conversation, which isn't necessarily related to anything that we've talked about, but I feel like in both the conversations that we've had, you carry, like what you're saying, you carry this grace, and you centralize the gospel, which is just so beautiful, and you can see that you delight in God's word, and that just comes through as you speak. So how do you keep your heart soft being in the field that you are, you're an academic, you're constantly in this place of pulling things apart and critiquing and seeking for understanding. Because in my experience, a lot of academics, they have a lot of knowledge and wealth of wisdom to impart. But then there's always, not always, there seems to be sometimes a disconnect between that relational side of like the love for God and the realization that like they get to do this because of who God is. So I don't want to make assumptions that that's where you're at, but it certainly comes across as you talk and as you explain these things that there's this softness of heart, and you really enjoy what you're doing, but at the same time there's like this love for Jesus.
We're poor physicians of our own souls, aren't we? We don't understand ourselves very well. So I'm probably the worst person to ask this question of. I think, and again, this is going to sound like, you know, the stock pious answer, but genuinely, I am not a great keeper of my own heart, but God is. And he has shown himself exceedingly skilled in doing that. In ways that have not always been bolstered by me, you know, being on the same, having the same agenda. There have been things that have helped me over the years, but I don't think these are the key factors. I think these are just like icing on the cake that God has baked. So, regularly reading Christian material that's at the same level as the academic non-Christian material that I'm reading has been a great blessing. So when I did my PhD, I tried to take Saturdays as my Christian reading day and make sure that, you know, as I was reading dense, very dense French philosophy, Monday to Friday, I was, you know, reading some really chunky, meaty Christian stuff. On Saturdays, that was a blessing. And just to keep that going. And so not to let the academic side of me outpace or dwarf the Christian side, you know, such that I was really sophisticated in my philosophical thinking, but still quite babyish in my Christian thinking. That's been a blessing. But I don't think that was a clincher. I think God's grace to me, unbidden and some points in my life unwelcome, has been the real clincher.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, so just in closing then, what's a question that you would give to our next guest?
Okay, this was a question that I was once asked on a podcast, and I both thought it was really good and really hard to answer, so I'm going to bless your next guest by asking this. If you could bring back any 3 people from the dead and put them in a room and have a conversation with them, which 3 people would you bring back and why?
Wow, that is great. Did you have a response for that one?
I think I did. I can't remember who it was now. I might have had Descartes, Augustine, and someone else. I can't remember.
Yeah, that is a great question. I love it. I'll have a lot of fun with that one as well.
I hope your next guest doesn't think I'm cruel asking such a question.
No, I think it's great. Yeah, Chris, thanks so much for your time. It's always a pleasure, and I'm always blown away just in the grace-filled responses you have to some really, intellectual and profound questions that people are asking and wrestling with. I think it's a beautiful thing to continue to point to Christ in and amidst it all. if people are wanting to find out more about yourself or your work, where would you direct them to?
I am on X as Dr. Dr. Chris Watkin, and also on Blue Sky under the same handle. I do have a website, christopherwatkin.com, that I don't update as often as I should. Those are probably the best. Oh, and a YouTube channel as well.
Awesome.
I don't know how to search for that, but if you look me up, hopefully you'll be able to stumble across it. I think it's got a name with lots of numbers in it.
Yeah, I'll throw it up in the episode description as well, so people can find it easier as well. No worries.
Fantastic.
Well, thanks so much for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
It's been a real joy speaking with you, Caleb. All the best with that newborn. It's quite a season of life.
It is. Thank you so much.